Hello, my name's Alison Cleary and I'm the Executive Director of Open House Melbourne, and I'll be your moderator for this evening's event. Before we begin, I do want to assure you all that in the planning for tonight's Facebook Live event, we've been very mindful of the social distancing requirements that are currently in place in Melbourne, and we've taken a number of measures to ensure that we are all working safely. Here in the downstairs foyer of the Victorian Parliament Members Annexe, we have a minimal number of people on site and several hygiene stations in place. And like so many others around the city working from home, all of the planning for tonight's event has been conducted online from our bedrooms. We send our best wishes to everyone who's tuning in this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge that our programming for Open House exists on what always was and always will be the land of the people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as to all First Nations people in the wider Melbourne community and beyond. Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded in Australia, and we try to be mindful of this in everything we do, given our organisation's focus on the modern built environment. And now to this beautiful space in which we're sitting and today's speakers. It's my absolute honour today to be here in the foyer of Parliament House Annexe with two Peters. The Peter to my left is Peter Elliott, architect of this incredible building, and the Peter to my right is Peter Lochert, the client and Secretary of the Department of Parliamentary Services. We're here with you this evening to talk about the design and construction of the annex from the perspective of Peter the architect and Peter the client. Also, as this is a Facebook Live event, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions of our speakers. Feel free to send those questions through at any time. We have a team of moderators who will be pulling these together, and we'll go to your questions in the final 10 or 15 minutes of the presentation. Now, before I let the Peters loose, I'll tell you a little bit about them both. Peter Lochert has been the Secretary of Department of Parliamentary Services since April 2010. And prior to that, he was the Director of Organisation Development and Finance in the department since 2005. As Secretary, he's responsible for service provision to MPs, both houses and parliamentary committees, including Finance, Human Resources and Risk Management, Information Technology, electorate officers, security, Hansard, library, catering and maintenance of Parliament House precinct. In this role, he's also a member of the Parliamentary Executive Group with a focus on strategic planning, governance structures and policy advice to the presiding officers. Peter's held a range of senior executive positions in public and private sectors and has extensive experience in resource management with particular strengths in human resources, change management, information technology and finance. His qualifications include a Bachelor of Science in Biology and postgraduate qualifications in business, leadership and management and professional qualifications in company directorship. And to Peter Elliott. Peter is a well-known and well-loved Melbourne architect and recipient of the 2007 Gold Medal from the Australian Institute of Architects, which is the highest award for an architect in Australia. He is currently an adjunct professor of architecture practice at the Faculty of Art and Design and Architecture at Monash University. In 2015, Peter was awarded an honorary doctorate of architecture by the University of Melbourne. He has a special interest in the design of the public realm and has lectured and written extensively on contemporary architecture and urban design. In 2015, he authored the book Episodic Urbanism, and his practice has won more than 75 national and state architectural and industry awards. These include an Order of Australia in 1987 for services to architecture in public housing, the Institute of Architects Victorian Architecture Medals for the Carlton Bars and Community Centre in 1991 and for this beautiful space in 2019. Also, I will introduce the building because it too has received many accolades. The annex, in addition to being awarded the Victorian Architecture Medal in 2019. Also won the 2019 National Institute of Architects Award for Urban Design, the National Architecture Award for Sustainable Architecture, again in 2019, the Premier's Design Awards of the Year in 2019, and Best in Category for Architectural Design. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
And Peter.
Thank you. Thank you.
I thought I'd kick off by reading a quote from the citation for the 2019 Architecture Medal, Victorian Architecture Medal. This quote jumped out at me because it captures a number of things that I think we can talk about this evening. The quote goes, "The highly considered design approach, evident at all levels of urban design, architecture and interiors, is founded upon a strong commitment by the client to addressing the significance and sensitivity of this project. The outstanding design demonstrates confidence in making public architecture and was executed by traditional architect-led means with long-term decision-making at the forefront." So I think that frames the conversation very nicely. But to put it in context, what I think we need to do is go back, Peter Lochert, to what existed before, to the Chook House. Can you paint a brief picture of what it was like to be a parliamentarian working in the Chook House and what the problems were that this building was challenged with overcoming?
Sure. You probably need to go back even a little bit further than that to the vision of Knight and Kerr, the original designers. Two things about Parliament House. A, it was never completed. So what we see here today is an incomplete version of what that vision was. The second thing is that even that vision didn't ever consider that members of Parliament were going to need the sort of contemporary accommodation that you need in 2020 and beyond. Back in the early days, 1850s, 54, 56, when this building was first built, members of Parliament were usually men, not paid, owners of land or businesses, and did not have staff. So they would just come together in the chamber, debate, vote, make laws, go back to wherever their businesses were and something like that. Move forward several decades and politicians became professionals. They became full-time paid people doing the job. They had staff, and the building certainly wasn't keeping up with that. So there were all sorts of arrangements where corridors were closed off and partitions put in to make offices. And at some stage in the late 1970s, mid-1970s, Peter, roughly, somebody decided to put a little bit of better accommodation and using the really good materials of the day, asbestos, lead paint and all of those sort of good things. They did a temporary building, decanting nearly 40-odd members into there with the hope of doing something more permanent in Parliament House. The accommodation generally was really appalling to be. When we started bringing public through and showing them where members of Parliament were working, they realised that that's not the sort of thing that you would have in any sort of business or, you know, offices or things like that. We had one area of the building, the East Wing. We had about 30-odd members accommodated there. It was known as the by-election corner. It didn't even have proper fire escapes. So if we'd had a fire during a sitting day, we would have a lot of by-elections. So when a lot of, you know, these attempts were made over the years to remedy that and to address it. And when we came to this project, and we'll talk about the various sort of things that drove what the final result is, but really what we were trying to do is to give members of Parliament accommodation that was at least to the standard that you would find in a normal office environment in the Melbourne CBD for a professional to work in. And addressing just that long-term need, but always with the view that if we didn't do something like that, then Parliament House just wasn't going to be able to function as the seat of the Parliament in future.
I think one interesting thing to add there is that all of the schemes from that period on all failed to get any support, mainly because of two reasons. One, they cost too much money. Parliament was never going to vote for that. Yeah. And the second reason was just the complexity of how do you finish that building? Do you do it in a contemporary manner? Do you just use the Peter Kerr drawings? So the genius of what's happened for this, which we can thank Peter and his crew for, is to separate this building as an annex and leave the task of finishing that building to another day. And in doing so, it just freed the whole thing up. It made this an economical building to build and in a contemporary manner. So we just didn't need to deal with all of the old baggage that came with trying to finish Parliament House.
So you didn't have to respond to anything there because it was
only to the extent that the two buildings serve each other and therefore they have to interlink. And we're still working on that kind of aspect of the building now. But no, the genius was separating it into a separate building.
So I guess what I'd be interested in you both talking about is what were the top three design imperatives when you were looking at building this building. What were the top three things that absolutely had to be here, and how did you respond to those?
Mine, I guess our priorities were mostly numbers. The budget we had, the number of members we needed to accommodate, and the fact that we had to keep it outside of the fabric of the old building. So one of the early challenges, I suppose, and one of the things about getting to know Peter and his crew was, how do you communicate to them that in fact we didn't really have any preconceived ideas of what something like this should look like. On the contrary, we were very open to all sorts of ideas, but we knew that we had limits. Funding, that's all we had. And Parliament paid for pretty much most of this building out of savings. We're very conscious. One of the reasons why work in this building has not been done for decades is that whenever you ask government for money to spend on Parliament House, government is faced with a problem. I mean, okay, so you want me to give you $5 million to replace some stonework? Well, that's $5 million I could put into a school, into a hospital, into a road or whatever. So it's this continuous competition. So we had to work on looking for funds internally through efficiencies, through savings. And so that was unmovable. We knew that we needed to accommodate 101 MPs. There are 128 MPs in Parliament at the moment. If we take cabinet, leadership, presiding officers, that left 101. And then the fact that you were looking at two buildings, rather than the one. And those were the parameters we really had to talk to Peter about.
Yeah. Well, given that, you've got let's just say it's 100 officers. And there's the ringing of the bells thing, like basically when the bells ring and the two chambers, one or both chambers are then calling for the politicians to meet to the chamber and the doors are locked. It was 3 minutes, now it's 4 minutes, but essentially the building had to be designed so that wherever you were in the complex, you had to be able to get to the chamber. The other interesting thing was, 100 officers is quite a lot, and we were very determined because of this beautiful setting. The building is built in a heritage garden. Is that every office should have a view. And in this case, we worked out this idea of the annular courtyard is the perfect architectural model because the level we're on at the moment is in the lower courtyard, so it's a single loaded corridor with only the rooms facing the inner courtyard, and the level above, which is the natural ground level, has offices facing the perimeter garden and the inner courtyard. And so it's a bit like a big sausage machine that's basically been cut up. And the other interesting thing about this is just understanding the way the political world that this building had to satisfy, which is quite divisive. It's not like it's all cosy. And so the building's been designed with staircases and breakout areas, not big areas, in the four corners of the building, so that there are multiple ways to get around within the building, and there are little networks or little neighbourhoods basically created so that as the numbers vary through the occupation of the building, you could create these kind of neighbourhoods where politicians felt comfortable.
And if there was someone you didn't want to see,
Yeah,
you could avoid them.
You could avoid them, yeah.
Yeah.
So but on the two levels, it's sort of, we tried very hard to create a convivial building, one of great sociability if you choose to, but equally if you didn't want to, then there was another way of working it.
Okay. So what was the inspiration for the design inspiration? You've talked about the Heritage Garden. We've talked about the existing building. Did you draw on other design inspirations for the space?
Sure. I think mature architect like I am, kind of been around a fair bit, and there are always favourite buildings. I think the most obvious thing about this building, and we talk about three key ideas that we started with. The first is what we call companion architecture, where the task here to build a contemporary building in the shadow of such a grand and beautiful building as Parliament House, incomplete as it is the first task that as a contemporary architect you have to deal with. So what kind of building is going to sit comfortably with this glorious building? The second issue is the fact that you're building in a garden, and we saw that as what we call topographic architecture. Essentially, the building is merged into the landform, so it becomes part of the garden. And so whether you're in the garden or in the building, you always have this extraordinary direct relationship with the setting. And the third thing is this idea of the connected building, that this is a service building. It only contains parliamentary offices. It doesn't contain meeting rooms or any of those other things. That all happens in Old Parliament House. So there are three links. There's the tunnel link we can see behind us, there's the laneway link, and the roof terrace link.
Okay.
So when you combine those things, and then the idea of the massive roof garden. I mean, the roof garden is glorious. I mean, it's a wonderful thing. When you're on there, you feel like you're within the city. You feel the sort of sense of being in the city, and yet it's this calm and beautiful place. So I think once, like a lot of architectural ideas, the core ideas are actually quite simple, and they were struck pretty early on. I think, Peter, weren't they?
Yeah,
They were presented.
but the interesting thing for me, given that, going through the process, I was obviously learning from these guys and testing, how is this going to work? So you start with what Peter describes as a simple process, and it really did look like a sausage or a zipper at one stage.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, you realise, hang on a minute, we've got this heritage tree and that heritage tree and that heritage tree, and all of a sudden you need to start compromising that pure design with the functionality. One of the things that was essential to this is that whole idea of the functionality of the building. You had to get, essentially, a member to walk, even if they had a walking stick or an inability to walk very fast, from there to the chamber before the doors close. So there is that architectural design and the functionality that was constantly iterating. And that was a feature for me, at least, of the early bit of the process.
Yeah, so I could add a fourth idea, which is what we call negotiating the site, which is, as Peter said, there's an interesting thing with the old bowling green up at the top end of the site, which forced the northern wing to have a crank in it. We might not normally have done that, but it's fortuitous because it's created like a much more kind of a sense that the courtyard is being wrapped by the building. And likewise, there are little nicks in and out of the building where trees have to be kept or a view. And one of the things that happened very early on is the extraordinary view to the east with St Pat's Cathedral and the beautiful little St Peter's Church, which most people never get to see, the view that Parliament has. So we dropped a whole level of offices to allow the garden, the Heritage Garden, to fold into the inner courtyard. So there are two stylistically different gardens. There's the 19th century Heritage Garden, which is folded into the interior of the courtyard, and then there's a contemporary Australian garden on the roof.
On the roof. I was up on the roof earlier and it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And that view across is extraordinary.
It is stunning. Yeah, people just go, wow.
Wow, so felt very privileged being able to see that. Aside from the statutory requirements and managing the books, what How much involvement, Peter, did you have in influencing the design outcome?
I don't know that that's a hard
I
question
can answer
to
it
answer.
for you.
Well, I'm going to pass across and see what you think.
It's really hard, and I sort of, when you go back and sort of you think about it, it was really interesting that the early process was very iterative.
They were.
And that was, we were hugely conscious of, the high heritage value of the building, the fact that we had to negotiate through all of that. Parliament has to be seen to be a model citizen in that sense. The value of the area in terms of, the old archaeology, both European and Indigenous, and all of those sort of things weighed, in the thinking. And whenever Peter and his team, were coming up with suggestions and we were putting counter suggestions and so on, those were the things that were driving our thinking. How that influenced, I don't know.
Well, iterative is the right word, because I think one of the really good things that happened in this process is a direct relationship. You can tell even now, 5 years after the building was when we first started on the project, it took 3 years to build and it's now nearly 2 years old, is this building of almost like a friendship, a client-architect relationship, is the only way that you get buildings like this, is that there's a respect and trust built between the two parties, and that there's a kind of conversational attitude that happens where ideas are put forward, debated, and then you move on. And what we had for the entire length of the 3 years were 2 weekly PCGs. So every 2 weeks, I don't think we missed one, we would present information, it was debated, the best things out of that were taken to the next one. And so what happened is that through a very close working relationship between client and architect, you could see the project coming to something really good, because the client was taken on the journey. Like, they're on the journey, we're on the journey, and often this doesn't happen. You get a very short period to present to a project manager or some large committee or something. The real advantage here is that Peter oversaw the project and managed the risk. I have to be frank, we were pretty apprehensive about working for Parliament, not the institution, but the people, because, like the reputation that parliamentarians have, let's be frank. And Peter protected us from that completely. He managed to deal with the communication that was necessary with all of the complexities within an organisation like this, and he let us get on with the job of being architects. And that's I think the great contribution that Peter made.
I have to say, I have to bring a couple of other people into that, because I was a conduit, I suppose, to where I was particularly lucky that I was really well supported, by my team in Parliamentary Services, but also it was sort of an alignment of stars almost with presiding officers, treasurers and premiers and so on that actually supported us. And it was across the board.
I was sick of nothing happening.
Yeah.
And finally this was seen to be, this looks like a sensible idea, let's get on with it. And so I think there was momentum built in that spirit.
And I felt that I was able to then, for example, it was government and opposition, it was front benchers, it was back benchers, and all the relevant decision makers, they were all prepared to buy into that decision. And so in a sense, I was the conduit just for that. But none of that would have been hugely valuable if we hadn't been able to develop the trust that we did develop. Because, as Peter says, risk management was a big thing. And here in the Parliament, the biggest thing is the reputational risk. Financial risk and all of those sort of things, that's management 101. You just manage that. But reputational risk in an institution like this, that's a much bigger deal.
So do you think there was an awareness, you were able to cross party lines in that, and was there an awareness that what was happening was something for the future as well as...
Oh, totally.
So it was an investment in the future.
Very
it
much
wasn't
so.
just about
Correct. No.
legacy.
The really interesting thing was that when we were having those internal dialogues across the political spectrum, there was not a party political response. It was an institutional response.
Yeah.
You know, and that people knew that there had been umpteen tries. You know, you do a search of the literature and you find dozens of master plans and all sorts of things. Nothing had ever happened. And we were in a situation where, the building hadn't been maintained properly for 50 or 60 years. There were bits of the stone falling through. And you can't preach occupational health and safety, disability access, compliance with, building codes and things like that, and make laws about it and not comply with it. So the whole thing was very much geared towards that. It wasn't what people might think, politicians are always after something. What opened the eye of people was when we actually took them through. We took the media through, we took the cameras through, we took visitors through. I used to love taking
He's a very good tour guide.
tours of people over above the library dome.
Yeah.
Where, people used to say, how on earth can you walk through here? Well, guess what? See that little spiral staircase? Well, you've got to run it to get down there in 3 minutes to vote in the chamber. Members used to leave their shoes down at the bottom so that they would go up and down on runners, that kind of stuff. So the response was institutional, the response was for the future, awareness that if we didn't do something, the building itself and the use of the building itself was at risk.
Another interesting thing was that in building the annex, it freed up all those terrible spaces in there. So what that's allowed to happen, this has progressively happened since this building is open and it's continuing on, is to get rid of all those terrible little offices in corridors and under stairs and to free the building up and get back the original circulation system, which had been severely compromised, get back suites of rooms, which are really beautiful rooms that have been subdivided. And so it's not only that you get a new building that's quite beautiful, but you get to fix up and correct a lot of the terrible things that had happened to Old Parliament House.
Okay. Peter, I'm interested in, you have a lot of expertise in working in the public realm. And this is a very particular type of public realm building in that it's in and of the public realm, but not necessarily that accessible every day to the public. What are generally the challenges with working on public buildings, and how did this building differ from those general challenges?
Well, again, referring to, I suppose, the great traditions of architecture, the slightly sad thing is that the building's in the secure zone of Parliament. Let's be frank, like several years ago that wasn't the case. We weren't living in kind of walled compounds of security. And this place has the highest level of that kind of scrutiny. So, to Parliament's credit, they have open days and bookable tours, and they're very conscious about this is a legacy project that's owned by the people of Victoria, and therefore they ought to be able to see it. And you do get glimpses of it from outside. But I guess our view was that even though people couldn't get to see it, our responsibility as architects is for this idea of the civic presence of a building, its dignity in the place that it is, and the fact that it can be judged over time. And there are things, I suppose, that we've just learned about how you do that as an architect. And one of those things is like a bit obvious to say now, but it's quite hard to do, is that the elements of the building are actually quite simple. And one of the immediate inspirations was that beautiful scheme that Roy Simpson did at the back of St Patrick's Cathedral, which is a neighbour to this building. And it adopts very similar kind of urbanistic strategies to what our own interest as a practice has always been. And that's a building that it's similar ideas. It's embedded in the landform. It's got a series of fountains and terraces. It's got sunken courtyard. It doesn't compete with St Pat's, and yet it's a worthy contemporary building. So I think we went through, you can go through the mental process of saying, well, what are the really good attributes about that building? And there are lots of other examples locally and internationally, but that one in particular because it's a neighbour. And we found those in the concept for this building as well.
Okay.
So it's and then, you know, like, don't overcook it. Like, this can't be seen to be gold-plated, you know, but it has to have a civic quality to it. And I think the interesting thing is that when people come into the building, they feel that, because the spaces aren't hugely grand, but they're very highly considered. They're quite textural. You've always got the aspect to the garden. And so it's a very subtle thing, but it's all about, I guess, the kind of thinking that goes into, well, what is the civic? How do you make that feel the exterior of the building? And then how do you bring those qualities to the interior? And that's, I think, the task that, as a mature architect, that we've found in a building like this. And it's the best thing about being an architect. You know, to be a late career architect and to build something like this is extraordinary, you know, and the responsibility is enormous. Like, you do feel that. Well, early on you sort of didn't quite get the shakes, but let's just say...
There were a few moments, weren't there?
You sort of think, well, we don't want to mess this up. But on the other hand, because of the experience of working in the public realm, I know the things that make for good public architecture. And even though you don't know how the journey is going to ultimately go, then when you cross those little decision-making journeys, then you feel confident that the foundation ideas are going to be good. And with the good fortune of meeting the budget, the thing fitting just, and a really good team of other consultants, Paul Thompson and Taylor Cullery Lethlean for the landscape. Again, worked with them many times. And so there was a very strong working relationship between client and the group of consultants.
Okay. Peter, was this the first project of this size that you'd have been involved in?
No. In a previous life, I used to work at Swinburne University, and I was involved in some of the buildings for the Prahran campus of Swinburne in those days. So I had been involved in sort of building some of those larger, you know, public use buildings. Yeah.
So the reason I ask that is I'm interested to know in what for you was in the process of this building and the actual process as opposed to the outcome. What was the biggest surprise in the process for you?
Look, surprise in the process.
We got it built.
Well, yeah. I think it was leading up to starting. That's where a lot of my anxiety was greater, I guess. And once we sort of broke ground, and once we were in the process and we were engaged in that continuous sort of exchange and problem solving and doing that sort of stuff, there were lots of little surprises along the way. You know, some of the suggestions, some of the technology, the bubble deck. I mean, who on earth has ever heard of bubble deck in the real world?
Or,
you know,
geothermal, you know.
Or geothermal, and, you know, those sorts of things. I think the bigger surprise for me at the end, and I remember walking through the building, was just the feel of the building, was how calm it is. Because Parliament House, particularly on a sitting day, can have a certain frantic, manic quality to it. And one of the things that I had been told by many members over the years was they missed some sort of a more private kind of place. And the ultimate feel of the building is it's a very calm building. It's a very serene building. And what Peter was describing before about having these little neighbourhoods and so on, has members, we've left it to the various parties to organise who goes where and how, and they have created little neighbourhoods. So you've got groups, you know, and that has a certain collegiality to it, which helps to give, you know, the whole thing a really good feel.
Okay. What surprised you?
I think early on there was a lot of anxiety. It was a journey. Like, some days we'd come to the office and be planning what we were about to do and think, maybe today it's going to stop. You know, like, I think there there were so many things that could have stopped the project that you just had to believe that you could get through. And I think there was enough goodwill, and I think when people were, and I've seen this many times before, when people get anxious that, you know, you're building in a heritage garden, what the hell do you think you're doing? And so people get very defensive about those things. But when they see a concept that looks like it's meant to be, and you get through these little crucial thresholds.
But that realisation doesn't come until after.
I know.
So at the beginning we have plenty of...
Yeah. And this is the thing about what I have learned about this enormous patience, the fact that we as architects have to take people on this long journey, 3 years, in the belief that they got no idea what they're getting, kind of, let's be frank. A lot of people can't read drawings, can't even understand a three-dimensional model. So there's a lot of skill in us as architects, I think, in getting people to understand what they're going to get, but not really. And then hope that when they see it, that they get it. And that's what happened. Peter started taking tours through the building, and immediately people could read the spaces, get the sense of how the relationship with the garden, and then people relaxed. And then once people started to relax, and could see that the thing, just get on and finish it, you know. And I think from that point of view, that's when life got easier for everybody, even though, you know, we're still trying to get the best building we can. And the build quality is beautiful, I think. Because everyone realised that don't rush it, you know, like it, you know, just make sure it's good.
Okay. What are the, I mean, it's got some very notable, you talked about geothermal before and bubble deck. What are some of the key sustainability features in this building?
Well, the geothermal, you know, the bubble deck itself, but also the fact that the building is nested in the garden, and you look at the whole of the ground floor. I mean, that's just, you know, the thermal sort of mass of the building. Everything in the building is, I mean, compared with Parliament House, which has 1930s wiring in it, you know, everything's LED, everything is intelligent and addressable. We have building management systems. We are able to tune. We're able to each office, for example, has little switches. If you open the door, things come on. If it's not occupied for no activity for a period of time, it switches off. So you know, all of those sort of features are in, and probably one of the, and I know architecture medals and things like that are terrific and whatever. For me, probably the award that meant the most was that sustainability, the award, that because it places this in a really good position to demonstrate what we can, you know, achieve, gives it a very long life, justifies the investment, which is what the bureaucrat has to often, you know, justify and always look at. It makes sense to do it. It's taught us a lot of lessons about what we can retrofit into the old building as well. So there's a lot of that that's moving across.
Yeah. So you're able to take lessons from...
Yeah, I mean, this was really used as a way of modernising a lot of the systems that had just sort of got lost to time in old Parliament House, and that's progressively being implemented. So I think, I mean, Peter's right in the sense that you have a building which just has enormous thermal mass, both with the roof garden and the fact that it's got a minimal facade. Means that it already has very strong thermal credentials. And then the geothermal system, which is really interesting because not all a lot of projects sort of aim to try it, but they don't always work out because it's just not the right ground conditions or whatever else. And so here we have roughly 60, nearly 100 metre bores underneath the building in the courtyard, which are the sort of working part of the geothermal. It means that we don't, the great advantage of it, apart from the fact that the thermal part of it is kind of free, is that the plant areas are much smaller and you don't need the chillers. So for us, this was going to be always a massive problem. Where do you put chillers on a building that's read three-dimensionally in a garden? There's nowhere you can put them. So when you go around this building, you do not see grills, you do not see vents, you do not see any of that kind of normal clobber that's on a building. And I think from that point of view, the building is seamless like that, the way that it's managed to embed itself in the garden, and yet all of those things that are normally very hard to conceal have been done so, and yet you still have an incredibly efficient building.
And the result, when you look at the building and all of those elements in it, is actually a metre lower than the old Chook House was.
Okay.
And, when you stand on the members' balcony just outside of the members' dining room, the roof has the same level of that, and that's opened up that whole vista. There is nothing that sticks up, except the lift well at the end. So it's very, very clean. It's allowed...
And it's formed a kind of viewing, well, we call it the view datum, which is basically... which is struck from the first floor apartment, which is the principal floor. That's where the chambers are, that's where Queen's Hall and the vestibule is, and the dining areas. And so that sense of not blocking it feels like another ground plane. When you're on the roof garden, it doesn't feel like a roof. It just feels like part of the garden. And so what it's done is provide this beautiful plinth effect to the old Parliament building, particularly the East Wing, which is one of my favourite, the earliest part, the 1860s library extension's got a beautiful warm coloured stone. And was the model that was Peter Kerr's first section of the original building. That's how he wanted the whole building to be built.
Yep.
So, there's a number of things, and this is just largely brought about by having to match the levels. And so, in matching the levels and striking this idea of the view datum, and the roof garden being kind of meadow-like, like you're not got trees on the roof. It's meant to be a sensual sort of low-level garden, so it doesn't block views.
Okay. I have a couple of other questions, but I do notice that there are possibly some questions coming through from our audience, so I might actually throw across to a couple of those. We've got Ange on Facebook who's asked, were you influenced by any of the buildings in the surrounding precinct?
Well, I've already mentioned the St Patrick's Cathedral building, and probably because the fact that it's surrounded in the garden, there's for those of you that have people that can see what the building looks like, it's got two faces. It's got a perimeter bluestone inclined wall, which we call the rampart wall, and it's very much like the base of Parliament House. So the biggest influence for us is Parliament House, because it's the companion, but also we're very aware of that this is a civic precinct in itself and a collection of really beautiful buildings, in particular. The Treasury Reserve and St Pat's in particular, they're the ones that have got a mixture of heritage and contemporary buildings, and so we fit within that suite of architecture over multiple generations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I guess like people who like looking at architecture might find those little clues. I don't think they need to be overt, but, there are things there that you can see that learns from the history of architecture, but we do them in a very contemporary way.
Okay. This is another one for you, Peter, from Jackie, who's asked, could you outline how the building was sealed given the setting under and within the garden?
Right. Okay, well, having done a few underground buildings before, one of the tricks is trying to keep water out.
This is the bit that I'm listening to.
And I have to be frank, we haven't been 100% successful at that. But the strategy, the really smart strategy here is that when you dig a big hole, right, and then you build a building inside that hole, and then there's a perimeter around it, which is like a drainage layer and a service layer. So you can walk around underground. Outside of the perimeter of the building, hidden underground. So what it allows us to do is both put all the services in that perimeter area, so we get better ceiling heights in here, and it also means that if it ever leaks, we know where the water is. So and then the roof garden itself is the biggest thing. So the perimeter is easy to deal with because you just disconnect it from waterproofing requirements by what I just described, the void space. And the roof, again, the first thing that happens with roofs, if you start putting things through the structure, then that's going to leak. So what we have is what we call monoplane roofs, which is the bubble deck. And the bubble deck is simply a really clever prefabricated concrete plank system with hollow polystyrene balls, and then you pour the concrete over that. So you can reduce the extent of concrete by about a third. So that's both the weight and the thickness of the concrete. It's a very clever system and was perfect for this job. So what we've done is, and then there's a liquid membraning system over that, so that it falls to a section of perimeter gutters on the outside. So there's always the odd issue, but essentially the building has been thought out along those lines to make sure that the water doesn't get in.
Okay. Another question, which is not actually showing on my screen, but flicked up before, and it was from someone called Victoria, who wanted to know here it's come again.
Yeah.
Has the design of the new offices influenced or changed the habits and interactions of members in unexpected ways? Or in expected ways, I guess. I guess they don't have to take their shoes off.
Well, they don't have to take their shoes, and they're not going to sort of have the falls that they used to have on the stairs and things like that. So we're a little bit more confident that, you know, the general amenity is definitely a lot better environment to work from. And from that perspective, I suppose you see members being more comfortable in here. One of the things that we have noticed is that members work in the building much more.
Yeah.
And that is a definite sort of change, and it also aligns with the fact that particularly in the upper house we have a much larger crossbench than normally. So, you know, where normally the major parties would have, you know, their own facilities, headquarters and all sorts of things like that, or if you happen to be in government or if you're in opposition, you have your own facilities. Crossbenchers and independent members, you know, don't have those, and they have found that this building really, really serves their needs much better than old Parliament House could have in any sense. The other thing that has changed is that we no longer have this separation of council members on that side of the building, assembly members on that side of the building. Now we have party neighbourhoods, and so people are much more, you know, sitting in groups. It's more collegiate within their parties, and the fact that the building has this serene feel, you know, it's just a much.
It's an enjoyable work environment.
It's an enjoyable work environment. I mean, we've removed that stress of having to run up and down. You know, those stone spiral staircases, and having, you know, ramps and things like that. It's a level of stress and that is now been removed. Yeah.
So if you have a crummy space in the old building, you never like to be there.
Yeah.
You're given a beautiful new office with a view of the garden and all the modern facilities that a contemporary office has. And a lot of the members did express very openly how much they were enjoying just being in their office, you know, and how more productive they'd got. So,
and a lot of them are bringing staff in more often now too. Each member gets sort of a 20 square metre office, which is meant to accommodate the member, and up to 2 staff. So it's not, you don't have acres to spread around, and it's a little bit of a challenge in these times when you have to keep some distancing and so on. So that limits things. But under normal circumstances, that's another change where we see a lot more electorate officers, advisors and people like that working out of the building. The dynamic of the precinct has changed. Yeah.
Okay. I think we had a question from Morris earlier who was asking, if I can get that back up on the screen, I think Morris was wanting to know to what extent does the design or the outcome, I guess, of the building reflect the original vision for the building?
I think he's meaning the original vision of Parliament.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Look, I think the thing that has struck me in the process of working on the parliamentary precinct is the enormous respect I have for Peter Kerr, the original architect. I mean, Peter miraculously managed to find 1,500 drawings approximately, pretty much all hand drafted by Peter Kerr over a 40-year period. He survived palace coups, changes of government. He effectively remained the single design hand for the building. And So the civic nature of the building and the things that he fought for as an architect really interested me, because most of them he didn't quite get done. The building didn't get finished. He wanted the road, he didn't really want the garden around it. He wanted a much more sort of civic and urban kind of building. He wanted the building set back further from Bourke Street. A lot of these are sort of subtle moves, but it was quite clear from what we understand about Peter Kerr's vision for the building is that it didn't turn out quite like that. That said, we were very mindful of certain things, the space between this and the adjoining building, and also the axial nature of the building. There's sort of certain formalities about the way the building should be positioned relative to Old Parliament House. So there are subtle things. They kind of just observe, I guess, a kind of relationship thing without being slavishly, it's not what Peter Kerr had imagined, obviously. And what we did is make sure that that building could be finished one day, if it ever could, and there are parts of it that can be finished more reasonably, the north wing in particular, and completing some of the things that this building was forced to have to deal with because of the fact there was no stairs and lifts properly operating all levels. Front and back of the building don't connect properly. Like there are still ongoing operational problems in the building because it was never finished. So that's the idea about this is just one piece. There'll be further projects in the precinct that hopefully will deal with those problems as well. So you have to sit in this bigger continuum of like we're just one architectural moment in a 160 odd year history.
And I mean that element was really important for us because obviously, we've got this very institutional perspective. The building is 163, 64 years old now. And we have engaged in other projects. One of them was to restore the original stone facades and make the building waterproof and all of those sort of things. Every move was about longevity. So design life had to be around the 80 years or thereabouts. Flexibility in terms of future change and whatever, but in particular opening up and reclaiming as much of the original part of the building. And the intent behind that was whatever we do today takes the building back to the original bones and gives the opportunity to any future generation to take on and do whatever they want to do or can do. The challenge is always money towards the completion of that building. I mean, you look at Parliament House and you can, essentially, probably one of the 2 or 3 top heritage buildings in Victoria. It was the site of the original Australian Parliament.
Two extraordinary public buildings for the city.
This is where, Australia's first Parliament sat for 27 years. So it is a building that is worthy of, loving on. At the moment, it's a little bit like, an old aunt who's been sort of very much loved but needs a little bit of TLC.
And I'll ask you both this question, but I'll start with you, Peter. What is your favourite part of, and it doesn't actually have to be in this new building, it can be the old one, but what's your favourite part of Parliament House, the entirety?
I love getting up on the roof, actually. There is a part of the roof which is not very often or normally accessible. And working here, I'm very lucky to be able to go up there. But in particular, on the front of the building, there is an area there which is a very large platform, which a few people reckon would make a really good beer garden one day. But I'm not sure we're going to go there. But from there, you can actually look down towards Bourke Street and the whole vista. And you get a real sense of what Parliament House sort of means and its position in relation to the rest of the city. And when you really think about it, 1856, Victoria's population was what, 320,000 people? The guts to build a building like this for a little colony I mean, enormous vision,
Yeah.
really, and a lot of guts and determination from those early planners and those early architects and those early politicians and those early bureaucrats who all came together. And as much as they had a whole lot of fights about front, back, garden, not garden, piazza, not piazza, the building's there.
Yeah.
You know, it's wonderful.
That's a tribute to everybody.
And standing up on the roof and looking out really gives you a sense, you know, of where it fits.
What's your favourite, Ben?
I think there's two things for me. I think the first thing is just the classic front of the building. You know, like I often have my coffee or an evening drink in Spring Street over the road, and I just think that grand staircase, I quite like the fact that it's hard on Bourke Street. I think it gives it a kind of real urban presence. And then the big colonnade, and the fact that the rest of the building's kind of out the back is not very good, you know, because it never got finished. But the fact that Victorian confidence and that capacity to build a building of that kind of guts, to me, is just like, it's fantastic. It says the things that it needs to in a piece of architecture. And then contrary to that is the garden. You know, I just think the garden is beautiful. It's a Guilfoyle garden, they say, but certainly of that period. And there are beautiful aspects of strolling in the garden and looking back towards the back of Parliament. And I really do love the library wing, the east wing. But it's also just the sense of the garden and the fact that you feel like you're within the city, and yet it's this kind of inner haven. So it's those two things. I think it's the formality and strength of the building as a civic statement on the street, and then the beautiful garden, which is a sort of much more pleasurable thing to be in.
Well,
we've sort of caught the two of them.
Yeah. One of the really interesting elements, and we talked a lot about this in different contexts in here, is that presence of the building is very much a positive, but in today's terms can also be a bit of a negative in terms of a barrier to accessibility. This is meant to be the house of the people. And one of the things that I like about this building and the way that this building addresses those sorts of questions is that it is so open, so accessible, so contemporary in that sense. It doesn't have the inaccessible element of the presence.
And it speaks of a different period, doesn't it?
Oh, totally.
I mean, this is not about sort of grandiose architecture in a sense. The fact that it's almost a little benign, the way that it sort of is more about the garden than a big statement about the piece of architecture. Like in parts of the building is almost not seen. It's kind of gets sort of merged into the landform. So for us, and yet it's still a very strong building, but its message is very different to, which is what Peter's just been describing about, you know, the role of the original Parliament and its necessity to feel like it's in charge, and you know, it's the big boy on the top of the hill. Whereas this is much more about respect for the environment and people and the place that it finds itself. So I think that's, a number of people have commented about this, and it's that was a bit subliminal during the process, but it's quite clear now that the two buildings, whilst they're very extreme in their expression, actually do work together quite well, because there's some extraordinary spaces in the old building which are wonderful, and yet this is kind of the working part of the building.
So in many ways they reflect the reality of what the role of a Parliament House would be, which is that sort of leadership representational role, but representing what and whom and looking after what and whom.
Yeah. I mean, the people who are here, the people who are based here are precisely those, you know, who are representing the community in that expression of democracy.
One of the things I should note, actually, picking up on your favourite spot on the roof, is that actually on the weekend of the 25th, 26th of July, which is the big open house weekend where everything will be digital, unlike generally when it's physical, other people can actually see that secret space of yours, Peter, because on that weekend there's going to be a behind-the-scenes tour of the roof, as I understand it, as well as one in the press galleries. And I also think there's a very special moment that most people don't get to see, which will be the lowering of the chandelier in Queen's Hall, I understand. So people will be able to tune in and see those things.
It's great. I mean, honestly, no matter where you go in this building, there are interesting stories and wonderful things to see and experience. So, it's
fantastic.
It's great.
Well, I actually think I had many more questions. However, I think we've probably run out of time now. I just want to thank you both so much. I've loved that. I'm hoping everybody else has. And thank you for giving us a glimpse into the process and of the realisation of what is a beautiful building. We didn't actually get to talk about the materials, but there's some exquisite mountain ash, there's some local Castlemaine quartzite here on the floor. It's a beautiful building. The detailing is gorgeous. Anyway, I could talk for hours, but we don't have hours. So I'd like to thank you both for helping us understand both the challenges and the joys of realising a building such as this. And again, I just mentioned to everyone out there, this presentation has been part of Open House Melbourne's digital program this year. And please tune in, continue to tune in. Come and discover some more spaces. You can look us up on openhousemelbourne.org. There'll be a whole lot of virtual tours you can do from the 17th of July. To everyone in Melbourne, stay home and stay safe, basically. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alison.
Thanks, Alison. Peter.